How far will a person go to protect not just their land, but their very way of life? What happens when ruthless criminals unknowingly target someone who spent years hunting down the worst outlaws in the American West? The Raven Creek gang thought. They'd found an easy mark in Daniel Hayes's struggling cattle ranch, but they're about to learn that some fires reveal more than they destroy. The man whose property they torched wasn't just any rancher, he was Mason Shadow Hayes, the legendary bounty hunter who'd brought down the infamous Blackwater Syndicate 8 years ago. Now, after years of quiet ranching life, he's about to show them why even the most hardened criminals once feared his name. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind swept across Clearwater Valley, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and sage. Daniel Hayes stood at his ranch house's weathered porch, studying the distant storm clouds gathering over the granite mountains. At 42, his face carried the quiet strength of a man who'd seen more than most, though few would guess the true nature of those experiences. His hands, calloused from years of ranch work, gripped the porch railing as he tracked the movement of his cattle in the valley below. The Hayes Double Cross Ranch sprawled across 300 acres of prime Montana grazing land, its boundaries marked by ancient cottonwoods and carefully maintained fence lines. To any observer, it appeared to be exactly what it claimed, a modestly successful cattle operation run by a hard-working owner who'd bought the land 8 years ago looking for a fresh start. But there were details that more observant visitors might question. The barn's heavy doors, reinforced with steel beneath their wooden exterior, the precise placement of the outbuildings, creating clear lines of sight across the entire property. The way the cattle were arranged in specific patterns, not just grazing randomly, but positioned to reveal any unusual movement across the ranch lands. These weren't the choices of a simple cattleman. They were the careful preparations of a man who'd spent 15 years tracking the most dangerous criminals across 12 territories, a man who'd learned that survival often depended on seeing trouble before it saw you. "Storm's coming early this year," Emma Taylor observed, joining Daniel on the porch. The local school teacher had stopped by to discuss the upcoming harvest festival, but Daniel noticed how her eyes tracked the same sightlines he'd established, noting the same subtle signs of movement among the cattle. She'd been the first to recognize him when he'd arrived in Clearwater Valley, though she'd kept his secret. As the daughter of a U.S. Marshal, she understood the value of a carefully maintained cover. "Third time this month the herds have been restless," Daniel replied, his voice carrying the casual tone he'd cultivated since leaving his old life behind. "Wolves again, maybe?" But they both knew it wasn't wolves. The cattle's movement patterns told a different story, one of human predators testing the ranch's defenses, probing for weaknesses. The Raven Creek gang had been moving north, leaving a trail of burned-out ranches and robbed homesteads across 3 states. Local law enforcement seemed powerless to stop them, though Daniel had his suspicions about why. "Sheriff Anderson's deputy came by the schoolhouse yesterday," Emma said carefully, asking questions about which ranches might be struggling with their loans. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. He'd suspected the gang had someone inside the local law enforcement, feeding them information about vulnerable targets. The questions about loans confirmed it. The Raven Creek gang's pattern was to pressure struggling ranchers into selling cheap, then burn them out if they refused. "Might be time to move those special supplies from the root cellar," he said quietly. Emma nodded, understanding the reference. The root cellar didn't just store preserved foods. It housed a carefully maintained arsenal, including the specialized weapons that had helped build Mason Shadow Hayes's reputation as one of the most effective bounty hunters in the West. "The children have been practicing their evacuation drills," Emma replied, referring to the network of safe houses they'd established throughout the valley. What had started as simple emergency preparations had grown into something more comprehensive. A community-wide system of mutual protection that few outsiders would notice. Daniel's attention shifted to movement along the northern fence line. 3 riders, moving with the kind of careful precision that marked them as professionals rather than casual travelers. They were good, using the terrain to mask their approach, maintaining separation to avoid drawing attention. But Daniel had spent years studying such movements, learning to read intent in the way a man held himself in the saddle. "Miss Taylor," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that didn't reach his eyes, "might be best if you mention to Reverend Parker that we'll need that special prayer meeting sooner than expected." Emma understood immediately. The prayer meetings were their code for gathering the valley's key defenders, the former soldiers, experienced hunters, and other capable residents who'd been quietly trained over the past 8 years. Daniel had selected them carefully, teaching them not just shooting and tactics, but the importance of appearing completely ordinary until the moment action was needed. "Of course, Mr. Hayes, though I hope you'll still consider donating one of your prize steers for the Harvest Festival auction." It was a clever addition to their cover. Any observers would see only a school teacher discussing community events with a local rancher. But as Emma descended the porch steps, her hand brushed against the hidden signal cord they'd installed years ago. In the barn, a small bell would ring twice, alerting Daniel's ranch hands that it was time to implement the security protocols they'd rehearsed countless times. The approaching riders were now close enough for Daniel to make out details. Quality. Horses, well-maintained weapons, the kind of gear that spoke of professional outlaws rather than desperate amateurs. The lead rider wore a distinctive black duster, and Daniel's memory flickered with recognition. Nathan Cross, the Raven Creek Gang's second-in-command, known for orchestrating their most brutal raids. 8 years ago, Mason Shadow Hayes would have already been moving to intercept them, using his legendary tracking skills to turn their own tactics against them. But Daniel Hayes, respected rancher and pillar of the Clearwater Valley community, simply continued his casual conversation about the upcoming Harvest Festival. The riders drew closer, and Daniel noticed how they evaluated the ranch's layout with professional interest. They saw exactly what he wanted them to see, a prosperous but unremarkable cattle operation, the kind of target their inside man at the sheriff's office had likely suggested. What they missed were the subtle defensive preparations hidden in plain sight, the carefully positioned buildings and equipment that could transform into firing positions at a moment's notice. "Afternoon, friend," Cross called out, his voice carrying the false warmth of a practiced predator. "Wondering if we might have a word about your cattle operation." Daniel adopted the slightly nervous manner of a rancher unaccustomed to armed visitors. "Of course, gentlemen, though I'm afraid I'm not looking to sell if that's what you're here about." Cross smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, we think you might change your mind once you hear our offer. Times are hard after all. Be a shame if anything happened to such a fine spread." The threat was clear, but Daniel's attention was already cataloguing details his visitors had missed. The way Emma's horse was taking a longer route back to town, warning others along the way. The subtle movements in the barn as his hands moved weapons and supplies into their prepared positions. The distant glint of sunshine on glass from the church tower where Reverend Parker's son, a former Army scout, would be watching the entire valley. 8 years of preparation were about to be tested. The Raven Creek Gang thought they'd found another easy target, another struggling rancher to intimidate and destroy. They had no idea they'd just threatened a man who'd spent 15 years hunting the West's most dangerous outlaws, a man who'd used his retirement to build something far more powerful than his old reputation. Daniel Hayes, once known as Mason Shadow Hayes, kept his expression carefully neutral as he invited the riders to dismount and discuss their business. The storm clouds were growing darker over the Granite Mountains, but the real storm was about to break right here in Clearwater Valley. Cross and his men dismounted with the easy grace of experienced riders, their movements carrying the subtle tension of men prepared for violence. Daniel noted how they positioned themselves, standard intimidation formation, with the two flanking riders slightly spread to control the scene. It was professional work, but predictable to someone who had spent years studying such tactics. "Beautiful. Spread you've got here," Cross observed, his eyes lingering on the well-maintained buildings and healthy cattle. "Must be quite a challenge managing it all on your own." "I get by," Daniel replied, maintaining his role as the slightly nervous rancher. "Community helps each other out here in Clearwater Valley." One of Cross's men, a younger outlaw with a distinctive pearl-handled revolver, snorted dismissively. "Community? Ain't gonna be much help when winter comes early. Word is the bank's been asking questions about your mortgage payments." Daniel allowed a flicker of worry to cross his face, though his mind was already noting details about the younger man. The way he carried his gun, the slight accent. This was likely Marcus Reed, rumored to be the gang's explosives expert. The Raven Creek gang was bringing in their specialists, suggesting this wasn't just another routine intimidation. "My financial arrangements are private matters, gentlemen," Daniel said, letting a hint of steel enter his voice. Just enough to make him seem like a proud rancher, not enough to reveal his true capabilities. Cross raised his hands in a placating gesture that didn't match his predatory smile. Now, we're just concerned citizens. These are dangerous times. Why, just last month, the Thompson place down in Cedar Grove had a terrible accident. Fire took everything: house, barn, livestock. Owner was lucky to get out alive. The threat was anything but subtle. The Thompson ranch burning had been the gang's first move into Montana territory. What Cross didn't know was that Daniel had already helped relocate the Thompson family, using contacts from his bounty hunting days to set them up with a fresh start far from the gang's reach. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Movement caught Daniel's attention. A flash of color from the church tower, Reverend Parker's son, signaling that the valley's defenders were in position. In the barn, he could hear his hands moving with practiced efficiency, following protocols established years ago. The preparations he'd spent 8 years refining were shifting smoothly into action. "Tell you what," Cross continued, clearly enjoying what he thought was growing fear in the rancher's demeanor. "We represent some investors interested in consolidating local properties. They're prepared to offer you a fair price, enough to clear your debts and start fresh somewhere else." Daniel made a show of considering the offer, using the moment to track more subtle movements around the property. Emma's warning had worked perfectly. He could see distant figures moving into prepared positions, community members who'd spent years training for exactly this scenario. The Raven Creek gang thought they were cornering a struggling rancher, but they'd actually walked into the center of a carefully prepared web. "And if I'm not interested in selling?" Daniel asked, already knowing the answer. Cross's friendly demeanor hardened slightly. "Like I said, accidents happen. It would be a shame if all your hard work went up in smoke. Sometimes a small demonstration helps folks see reason." The younger outlaw, Reed, patted the saddlebag, where Daniel knew they likely kept their incendiary supplies. The gang's pattern was consistent: threaten, demonstrate, then destroy if their targets didn't comply. They'd perfected a system of terror that had worked across 3 states, but they'd never encountered a target like the Double Cross Ranch. Every building, every fence line, every seemingly random piece of equipment had been positioned with purpose. The ranch wasn't just a working cattle operation, it was a fortress, disguised as one, designed by a man who'd spent 15 years hunting the West's most dangerous outlaws. "Mind if I discuss this with my hands?" Daniel asked, playing for time as he saw the final pieces of the valley's defense falling into place. "It's their livelihood too." Cross nodded magnanimously, clearly believing he had the situation under complete control. "Take your time. We'll be around. But don't take too long. Fire season's coming early this year." As the outlaws remounted and rode toward their likely campsite, Daniel maintained his worried expression. Inside, though, his mind was already moving to the next phase of a plan 8 years in the making. The Raven Creek gang thought they were setting up for another simple terrorize and burn operation. They had no idea they'd just threatened a man who had once been known as Mason Shadow Hayes, or that Clearwater Valley was about to teach them a harsh lesson about underestimating simple ranchers. As twilight settled over Clearwater Valley, Daniel Hayes moved through his property with practiced efficiency, his actions disguising careful tactical assessment as routine evening chores. The first stars were appearing above the granite mountains, their light competing with the warm glow from the ranch house windows, where Emma Taylor was now coordinating with Martha Sullivan, the telegraph operator who'd become an essential part of their valley's defense network. Inside the barn, Daniel checked on his ranch hands, though hands wasn't quite accurate for the carefully selected team he'd assembled over the years. Jack Wheeler, a former cavalry scout who'd served with distinction during the Apache campaigns, was methodically reviewing their weapons cache. Sarah Mitchell, whose skills with horses masked her past as one of the territory's most effective undercover Pinkerton agents, was preparing their mounts for quick deployment if needed. "Cross took the bait," Daniel said quietly, helping Wheeler inventory ammunition. "They'll make camp at Cottonwood Creek just where we predicted." Wheeler nodded, his weathered face showing grim satisfaction. "Reed's with them. Saw that pearl-handled revolver. He's their demolitions man. If they're bringing him in, they're planning something bigger than their usual ranch-burning operation." Daniel had reached the same conclusion. The Raven Creek gang's pattern had been evolving, becoming more ambitious. Their recent targets suggested they weren't just terrorizing ranchers anymore. They were systematically taking control of key water rights and transit routes throughout the territory. "Martha picked up some interesting telegraph traffic," Sarah added, her voice carrying the precise diction that betrayed her Eastern education. "Messages between Cedar Grove Bank and some investors in Chicago. Someone's buying up defaulted ranch loans, but the paper trail's been carefully obscured." This was new information, and Daniel felt the familiar spark of investigation that had served him so well in his bounty hunting days. The gang wasn't just burning ranches. They were part of a larger operation, using terror and violence to drive down land prices for wealthy speculators. "Mr. Hayes," young Tommy Parker, the Reverend's son, burst into the barn with the controlled urgency of someone trained to deliver vital intelligence. "Riders coming in from the north, but not the gang. It's Matthew Sullivan." Daniel's expression tightened. Matthew Sullivan was Martha's brother, and more importantly, a deputy marshal based in Helena. If he was riding in after dark, something significant had changed. "Get him to the root cellar," Daniel ordered. "Quietly. We don't want Cross's scouts spotting a lawman on the property." As Tommy hurried to intercept the approaching deputy marshal, Daniel turned to Sarah. "Those telegraph messages, any mention of a man named Lawrence Bishop?" Sarah's eyes widened. "Slightly. Yes, actually. He's the Chicago investor behind most of the loan purchases. You know him? 8 years ago, when I was still hunting bounties, I investigated a series of bank robberies in Colorado. Never could prove it, but I suspected Bishop was using the robberies to pressure banks into selling him defaulted loans at a fraction of their value. He'd then force the property owners out, consolidate the land, and sell it to railroad interests for 10 times what he paid." Wheeler whistled softly. "And now he's working with the Raven Creek gang, using them to drive down land prices across the territory." Daniel nodded grimly. "Which means Cross and his men aren't just common outlaws. They're enforcers for a much bigger operation." The arrival of Matthew Sullivan confirmed their suspicions. The deputy marshal, after being quietly guided to the root cellar meeting space, brought news that added crucial pieces to the puzzle. "Bishop's in Helena," Sullivan reported, accepting a cup of coffee from Emma. Arrived 2 days ago with a team of lawyers. He's meeting with territorial officials, trying to push through some kind of emergency land use regulation. Let me guess, Daniel said, something that would make it harder for small ranchers to maintain their water rights during drought conditions. Sullivan nodded. With this year's early winter coming, half the ranches in the territory could be forced to sell by spring. Bishop's positioning himself to buy everything at pennies on the dollar. And the Raven Creek gang provides the pressure to make sure owners sell to Bishop's consortium instead of holding out for better offers. Sarah finished, her analytical mind assembling the pattern. Daniel moved to the crude map table they'd established. In the root cellar, it showed not just Clearwater Valley, but the entire territory, with markers indicating recent gang activity, property sales, and water rights disputes. A pattern emerged. The gang wasn't just hitting random targets, they were systematically working their way through key watersheds, focusing on properties that could control water access to multiple valleys. Bishop's not just after land, Daniel realized. He's trying to control the territory's entire water supply. Once he owns the key water rights, he can dictate terms to every ranch, mine, and settlement in the region. That's why they brought in Reed, Wheeler added. They're not just planning to burn the Double Cross. They want to dam up Crystal Creek where it enters the valley. That would give them control of water flow to 3 counties. Emma, who had been quietly observing while maintaining her schoolteacher's precise notes, spoke up. The Harvest Festival Committee meetings. We've got representatives coming from every settlement in those counties. If we could get word to them about the bishop's plan. Daniel nodded approvingly. Emma's seemingly innocent community organizing had created the perfect network for spreading warnings and coordinating resistance. The gang and their wealthy backer had no idea that their targets were already connected, already preparing to stand. Together, Sullivan, Daniel turned to the deputy marshal. How many of the territorial officials meeting with the bishop are actually in his pocket? At least 3 judges and the land office commissioner, Sullivan replied grimly. But Judge Harrison is still clean. He's been building a case against land fraud schemes, though he doesn't know about Bishop's connection to the gang yet. This was crucial information. Daniel had crossed paths with Judge William Harrison during his bounty hunting days. The man was incorruptible, one of the few territorial officials who couldn't be bought or intimidated. If they could get evidence of Bishop's operation on Harrison, a subtle signal from the ceiling, 3 quick taps, interrupted their planning. Someone was approaching the ranch house. Sarah moved silently to the concealed observation post. They'd built into the root cellar's ventilation system. 2 riders, she reported professionally. One matches Cross's description, the other... Daniel, it's Marcus Reed. They're carrying torches. So it began. The gang was moving faster than their usual pattern, probably under pressure from Bishop to secure the water rights quickly. They were about to discover that the Double Cross Ranch wasn't the easy target they'd imagined. Wheeler, get a word to Reverend Parker. Tell him it's time for that special sunrise service he's been planning. Sarah, make sure Martha understands which telegraph lines need to go down at exactly the right moment. Sullivan, I need you to get that evidence to Judge Harrison, but first... Daniel Hayes, who had spent 8 years building a peaceful life as a rancher, felt the familiar calm of his old life settling over him. Mason Shadow Hayes had earned his nickname by turning outlaws' own tactics against them, appearing where least expected, using their own plans as weapons. Now, with the support of an entire community instead of just his own skills, he was about to demonstrate why he'd been considered the most dangerous lawman in the West. The Raven Creek gang thought they were about to burn down a simple ranch. Instead, they were walking into a trap 8 years in the making, one that would expose not just their operations, but the corrupt empire behind them. And it would all begin with a single torch carried by men who had no idea they were about to illuminate their own downfall. One more thing, Sarah interjected, her trained eye catching a detail others might have missed. Bishop's operation, it's too well organized for someone who's supposedly new to the territory. He's had infrastructure in place for months, maybe years. Daniel nodded, remembering details from his bounty hunting days that suddenly carried new significance. The Carson City bank robbery 2 years ago. Remember how the robbers seemed more interested in the bank's property records than the cash? That was Bishop, Sullivan asked, surprised. We always thought it was the Whitfield gang. The Whitfields were just muscle, Daniel explained, moving to the map table. Look at the pattern. Every major robbery in the past 3 years targeted banks with significant land records. Bishop wasn't just after money, he was gathering intelligence, learning which properties were vulnerable, which water rights could be controlled. Emma, who'd been studying the map with a school teacher's attention to detail, pointed to several marked locations. These prayer meetings I've been organizing, they're all in valleys that would be affected by Bishop's water control scheme. We've got representatives from every threatened community already connected, already working together without even knowing it. Wheeler grinned appreciatively. All this time, folks thought Miss Taylor was just being an enthusiastic community organizer. Nobody realized she was building a resistance network disguised as church socials. Speaking of networks, Martha Sullivan emerged from her telegraph station, paper in hand. Just intercepted a coded message from the bishop to someone in the territorial capital. They're moving up their timeline. Whatever they're planning, it's happening within the week. Daniel absorbed this information, his mind already adapting their preparations. The early winter that had everyone worried wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was a tactical opportunity for Bishop's operation. Struggling ranchers would be desperate for water access before the first freeze. "Show me that code," Sarah requested, her Pinkerton training surfacing. As Martha handed over the message, Sarah's eyes widened. "This is a variation of a railroad consortium code. I saw something similar when investigating land fraud cases back east. Bishop's not working alone. He's got backing from major railroad interests." The pieces were falling into place. Bishop wasn't just a corrupt businessman trying to control local water rights. He was the advance man for a much larger operation, using the Raven Creek Gang to clear the way for railroad expansion through the territory. A flash of movement from their observation post caught Daniel's attention. Cross and Reed were getting closer to the ranch house, their torches casting ominous shadows. But something about their approach bothered him. It was too obvious, too theatrical. "They're not just here to burn the ranch," he realized aloud. "This is a show meant to be seen. Bishop wants to make an example of the double cross, demonstrate what happens to ranchers who don't cooperate with his plans." "That's why they brought Reed," Wheeler agreed. "His explosives work is distinctive. Every rancher in 3 counties would recognize his signature style and know exactly who was responsible." Daniel moved to the weapons cache, selecting items with deliberate care. Not the tools of Mason Shadow Hayes, legendary bounty hunter, but equipment chosen for a different kind of operation. "Sullivan, you got 10 minutes to clear out. Take Emma's horse. It's already saddled behind the schoolhouse. Get that evidence to Judge Harrison." "And the rest of us?" Sarah asked, though her slight smile suggested she already knew the answer. "Bishop and his gang want to make an example of the Double Cross Ranch," Daniel replied, checking his carefully. "Maintained revolvers, so let's give them exactly what they want, just not the example they're expecting." Wheeler's grin turned wolfish. "Time to show them why you earned that Shadow nickname?" Daniel shook his head. "No, time to show them something they've never seen before. What happens when an entire community decides to stand together against men like Bishop? Mason Shadow Hayes hunted alone, but Daniel Hayes—" He looked around at the determined faces of his allies. "Daniel Hayes built something stronger than any legend. Emma moved to the ladder leading up from the root cellar, her school teacher's demeanor replaced by the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. "I'll signal the others. By morning, every threatened community in 3 counties will know about Bishop's plan." "And by morning," Martha added, her hand steady on her telegraph key, "those corrupt territorial officials will be walking into a trap of their own. Judge Harrison isn't the only honest lawman we've been keeping informed." Daniel Hayes watched. His companions move into their positions, each person playing their carefully rehearsed role in a plan that had evolved far beyond simple ranch defense. The Raven Creek gang was about to learn why their predecessor, the Blackwater Syndicate, had feared Mason Shadow Hayes. But more importantly, Lawrence Bishop was about to discover something far more dangerous than any legendary bounty hunter. The power of united communities standing against corruption. Above them, Cross and Reed approached the ranch house, torches raised, completely unaware that their attempt to terrorize a simple rancher was about to expose a conspiracy that reached all the way to Chicago's railroad boardrooms. The night was about to become very interesting indeed. The autumn wind carried the sharp scent of pine and sage through Crystal Creek Valley, but it also brought something else, the subtle sounds of movement as the Raven Creek gang positioned themselves for their attack on the Double Cross Ranch. Inside the concealed observation post built into the barn's hayloft, Daniel Hayes wasn't watching the approaching outlaws. Instead, his attention was focused on something they'd completely overlooked, the valley's scattered herds of grazing cattle. "Notice anything unusual about those cattle movements?" he asked Sarah Mitchell softly, gesturing to where several groups of steers were slowly shifting positions in the moonlight. Sarah, drawing on her Pinkerton training, studied the patterns for a moment before understanding dawned. "They're not random. The herds are moving in coordinated patterns, creating gaps in the gang's perimeter." 8 years of training, Daniel confirmed. Every rancher in the valley contributes a few heads, teaching them to respond to specific signals. Cross's men think they're watching for riders or people on foot. They're not paying attention to how the cattle are gradually reshaping their defensive positions. Wheeler joined them, moving silently, despite his cavalry background. "Just got word from Tommy. Martha's network is in place. Every telegraph line connecting Bishop to his corrupt officials is about to go dark, but in a very specific way." Daniel nodded approvingly. Martha Sullivan hadn't just planned to cut communications. She'd developed a system to make it appear that some lines were still working while others failed naturally. Bishop's organization would waste crucial time trying to coordinate through lines they thought were secure, not realizing their messages were being intercepted. "Wilson's spotted something," Sarah warned, indicating where the former Pinkerton was studying the ranch's outbuildings with professional suspicion. "He's noticing the reinforced walls." "Good," Daniel replied, surprising his companions. "Let him waste time analyzing the obvious defenses. He'll be looking for hidden gun ports, concealed firing positions, standard protective measures. He won't be thinking about things like a low musical tone drifted through the valley, barely noticeable unless you knew to listen for it. To the gang, it would sound like wind through the rock formations." But throughout Crystal Creek Valley, carefully positioned groups recognized Emma Taylor's signal, transmitted through a network of carefully hidden wind chimes she'd spent years installing under the guise of decorative schoolhouse projects. "Miss Emma's quite the innovator," Wheeler commented admiringly, "using sound to coordinate across distances without anything visible. Wilson's traditional Pinkerton training would never consider it." Daniel allowed himself a moment of pride in how his allies had each contributed unique solutions to the valley's defense. Emma's wind chime network, Martha's telegraph manipulation, the trained cattle. None of them traditionally military tactics, which made them nearly impossible for professional outlaws to detect or counter. "Movement at the main house," Sarah reported. "Reed's unpacking something from his saddlebags. Looks like..." "Daniel, Those aren't his usual explosives. Through his spyglass, Daniel studied the devices Reed was preparing. His expression hardened as he recognized the sophisticated demolition equipment. Military-grade charges. The bishops provided them with army explosives, probably stolen from the same shipments they've been hijacking. Those charges could do more than just damage. The creek, Wheeler warned. That kind of firepower could reshape the entire valley's watershed, which is exactly Bishop's plan, Daniel concluded. Once they burn the ranch, they'll use the explosives to alter Crystal Creek's course permanently. The fire will destroy any evidence of human intervention. Everyone will assume it was natural erosion caused by the burning. Sarah's sharp intake of breath drew their attention. "Daniel, look at Wilson. He's recognized something." The former Pinkerton had dismounted, examining the ground near one of the outbuildings with intense focus. Daniel knew what he'd found. Traces of the carefully concealed emergency shelter network that connected key points throughout the valley. "He's good," Daniel admitted. "Most people would miss those signs. But he's still thinking like a Pinkerton, looking for individual defensive measures. He hasn't realized that everything he's seeing is part of a larger system." Through gaps in the hayloft wall, they could see Cross growing impatient, gesturing for his men to take their final positions. The gang leader clearly wanted to begin their operation while the night provided cover, but Reed was still preparing his explosives, and Wilson's discovery had introduced an element of uncertainty to their planned assault. "Sir," Tommy Parker's whisper came from the concealed entrance behind them. "The Reverend says the first weather signals are showing. Storms moving in faster than expected. This was both a challenge and an opportunity. The approaching storm would complicate their defense of the ranch, but it would also confuse the gang's carefully planned operation. More importantly, it would make certain preparations that much more effective. Tell Martha to begin the next phase," Daniel instructed, "and make sure Emma's people understand. When those charges go off, we're not just protecting the ranch. We're exposing Bishop's entire operation." As Tommy slipped away to deliver the messages, Daniel turned to his companions. "Wheeler, get the special ammunition distributed. The storm will make traditional shooting difficult, but with the treated powder—" Wheeler grinned, understanding immediately. The specialized ammunition they'd prepared was designed to burn with distinctive colors, not just for identification in the dark, but to create specific signals visible through rain and mist. "Sarah, how many of Wilson's old Pinkerton procedures can you predict?" The former agent smiled grimly. "Enough to keep him looking in all the wrong places. He'll be expecting standard defensive tactics, hidden shooters, escape tunnels, maybe some traps. He won't be thinking about—" "Community," Daniel finished. 8 years of people working together, building something bigger than any one ranch, or one defender could create. Through the storm's approaching clouds, moonlight caught the signal mirrors Emma's students had spent years installing throughout the valley, disguised as simple decorations. Each mirror was positioned to relay messages across vast distances, but only if you knew exactly where to look and what patterns to watch for. "Cross is getting ready to move," Sarah reported, studying the gang's positions. "Reed's charges are placed, and Wilson thinks he's identified our defensive capabilities." Daniel Hayes felt the familiar calm of imminent action settling over him, but it wasn't the cold focus of his bounty hunting days. This was different, the quiet confidence of a man who had built something larger than himself, something that would outlast any legend. "Bishop and his gang think they're about to destroy unstubborn ranchers' resistance," he said softly. "They have no idea they're about to expose corruption that reaches all the way to Chicago's railroad boardrooms. And it all begins with them burning exactly the wrong ranch." The storm's first distant thunder rolled across Crystal Creek Valley, as Cross raised his torch, preparing to signal the attack that would begin Bishop's grand demonstration of power. But a subtle movement caught Daniel's attention, something even Wilson's trained eye had missed. The irrigation channels, Sarah whispered, following his gaze. They're not just for water distribution, are they? Daniel allowed himself a small smile. The network of irrigation ditches crossing the Double Cross Ranch appeared perfectly normal to anyone familiar with cattle operations. What wasn't obvious was how those channels had been carefully engineered to serve multiple purposes. Martha's brother helped design them, he explained quietly. The whole system can be redirected with just a few simple gates. When the storm hits, Wheeler's eyes widened as he understood. The channels become a defensive network. You can flood specific areas, create obstacles where there weren't any before. And with Reed's explosives placed exactly where they are, Sarah added, her tactical mind racing ahead, any attempt to destroy the ranch's water access could trigger a chain reaction they won't expect, Daniel confirmed. Bishop's engineer drew up plans to reshape the valley's watershed, but those plans didn't account for what we've built beneath the surface. Through the gaps in the barn wall, they could see Wilson growing increasingly agitated, gesturing urgently to Cross. The former Pinkerton's instincts were warning him that something wasn't right, but he was still thinking like a law enforcement agent, looking for traditional threats and countermeasures. "Tommy," Daniel called softly, knowing the young man was waiting in the concealed passage. "Tell Martha it's time to activate the second set of telegraph signals. Let's see how Bishop's organization handles some confusion in their communication network." As Tommy slipped away on his mission, Daniel turned to his companions. "Wheeler, get the specialized ammunition to the outer positions. Sarah, make sure Emma's network understands. When those charges go off, everything has to move exactly as we planned." A new sound joined the approaching storm, the distant toll of the church bell, ringing what appeared to be a normal evening service pattern. But to those who knew what to listen for, each ring carried specific meaning, coordinating defenders across miles of territory. Bishop thought he could control these valleys through fear and corruption, Daniel said quietly, watching Cross prepare to launch his assault. He never understood what makes this land special. It's not the water rights or the grazing lands, it's the people who've chosen to build something here together. In barns, homesteads, and hidden shelters throughout the region, communities that Bishop thought he could intimidate into submission were about to demonstrate something he'd never considered, the power of unity against corruption. And it would all begin with Cross and his gang, thinking they were about to destroy one stubborn rancher's resistance. They had no idea they were about to expose a conspiracy that reached from Crystal Creek Valley all the way to Chicago's railroad, boardrooms, or that their own actions would provide exactly the evidence needed to bring it all crashing down. The first raindrops struck the Double Cross Ranch's weathered roof, just as Cross raised his torch to signal the attack. But before he could give the command, an unexpected sound cut through the storm's approach, the clear, precise toll of the church bell, ringing what seemed to be a standard evening service pattern. Wilson, the former Pinkerton, suddenly stiffened in his saddle. "Wait!" he called to Cross, his trained ear catching something in the bell's rhythm. "Something's not right." That pattern, but Cross had already committed to the assault. His torch swept downward, sending his men surging forward toward the seemingly vulnerable ranch buildings. In that same moment, Daniel Hayes's years of preparation began to unfold with clockwork precision. The first sign that something was wrong came from the cattle. Instead of panicking at the approaching riders, the herds moved with uncanny coordination, creating obstacles that forced the gang to adjust their carefully planned approach. Years of subtle training had turned the valley's livestock into an integral part of its defense. "Now, Martha," Daniel whispered, knowing that miles away, the telegraph operator would be implementing her part of the plan. Throughout the territory, carefully selected telegraph lines began to fail, while others remained operational, creating a web of confusion in Bishop's communication network. The gang's first wave reached the outer buildings, torches raised triumphantly. Reed, their demolitions expert, moved to place his military-grade charges at key points around the ranch's water access. But as the rain began to fall in earnest, the ground beneath their feet was already changing. They haven't noticed the irrigation channels, Sarah observed from their hidden position. The complex network of ditches, disguised as standard ranch irrigation, was quietly redirecting the storm's runoff exactly where Daniel had planned. Wilson, however, was starting to understand that something was very wrong. His Pinkerton training had taught him to recognize patterns, and too many small details weren't adding up. The cattle's movements, the bell's rhythm, the way the ranch's defenses seemed simultaneously obvious and oddly incomplete. "Cross!" he shouted over the increasing storm. "Pull back! This isn't just a ranch defense, it's—" His warning came too late. The first of Reed's charges detonated, but instead of destroying the ranch's water access, the explosion triggered something entirely unexpected. The carefully engineered irrigation system, now swollen with storm runoff, transformed the surrounding ground in seconds. What had appeared to be solid ground between the gang's positions became a network of deliberately flooded channels. Horses lost their footing. Carefully planned formations broke apart, and Bishop's expensive military explosives found themselves submerged and useless. "Clever bastard," Wilson snarled, finally recognizing the full scope of what they faced. "The whole ranch is a prepared battleground. Those reinforced walls I spotted, they weren't the real defenses at all. They were decoys to keep us looking in the wrong direction." But Daniel's true masterpiece was only beginning to unfold. As the gang struggled to regroup, the first shots rang out, not from the ranch buildings where they'd expected resistance, but from multiple positions throughout the valley. The specialized ammunition Wheeler had distributed produced distinctive flame patterns visible through the rain, each color and sequence carrying specific meaning to the defending forces. Cross, realizing his carefully planned attack was rapidly disintegrating, bellowed orders for his men to fall back and regroup. But the retreat proved just as challenging as the advance. The trained cattle had quietly shifted again, herding the gang's horses toward pre-selected killing grounds. "Sir," Tommy Parker's voice came urgently from the concealed passage. "Martha reports Bishop getting conflicting messages. Some telegraph lines say we're fully engaged here. Others report everything's quiet. He can't tell what's really happening." Daniel nodded in satisfaction. Martha's systematic disruption of Bishop's communication network was working perfectly. The corrupt businessman would waste crucial time trying to verify reports, unable to coordinate an effective response. "Wilson's figured it out," Sarah reported, watching the former Pinkerton's movements. "Look at how he's studying the valley now. He's finally seeing the bigger picture." Indeed, Wilson had pulled back from the main assault, his professional training allowing him to recognize the true nature of what they faced. This wasn't just a fortified ranch with some clever defenses. The entire valley had been transformed into an interlocking system of obstacles, firing positions, and controlled zones. 8 years, Wilson said, loud enough for his voice to carry through the storm. "You spent 8 years building this, Hayes. Not just defending a ranch, creating a whole defensive network disguised as normal valley life." "You're half right." Daniel called back, letting his voice project from an unexpected direction. "But you're still thinking like Pinkerton, Wilson. Still looking for one man's clever plan." A series of explosions lit up the night, but not from Reed's charges. Years ago, Daniel had placed his own carefully hidden demolition points throughout the valley. Now, as they detonated in sequence, they cut off the gang's prepared escape routes while simultaneously exposing hidden evidence of Bishop's larger operation. "Those are railroad survey markers," Wilson realized, seeing the metal stakes and documentation the explosions had unearthed. "Bishop's plans for damming the valley, redirecting water rights. You didn't just prepare to defend the ranch, you spent 8 years gathering evidence." Cross, finally grasping that his entire force had been maneuvered into a trap, tried to rally his men for a desperate push toward the ranch house. But the storm had intensified, and in the darkness, the specially treated ammunition created an illusion of defenders everywhere. The bell, Wilson suddenly understood. It wasn't just signaling. You've been training the whole valley to respond to specific patterns, every ranch, every homestead. His voice trailed off as new lights appeared through the storm. Lanterns, being lit in precise sequences across the valley, what looked like random farmhouse illumination to untrained eyes, was actually a sophisticated communication network, coordinating defensive efforts across miles of territory. Bishop thought he could control these valleys through fear. Daniel's voice carried clearly, though none of the gang members could pinpoint its source. Thought he could use men like you to frighten simple ranchers into submission. But he never understood what he was really facing. Wheeler's specialized ammunition created another series of distinctive flashes, and suddenly the gang found themselves caught in precisely coordinated crossfire. Not from professional gunmen, but from ordinary ranchers and farmers who had spent years practicing for exactly this moment. This isn't just about defending one ranch, Daniel continued, as Cross's men realized they were completely surrounded. This is about exposing corruption that reaches from Crystal Creek all the way to Chicago, and you just helped us prove it. Wilson, his Pinkerton training allowing him to grasp the full implications, laughed bitterly. The fire. You wanted us to try burning the ranch, because once Bishop's men officially torched the property, every land office document he's filed, every water rights transfer he's arranged in advance, Daniel confirmed, becomes evidence of criminal conspiracy. You didn't just walk into a trap, Wilson. You walked into a legal noose that's going to hang Bishop's entire operation. The storm's fury matched the chaos now engulfing the Raven Creek gang. Their careful plans had been turned against them, their superior numbers rendered meaningless by years of meticulous preparation. But more importantly, their very presence had provided the final evidence needed to expose Bishop's corrupt empire. Through the rain and darkness, Daniel Hayes watched as his years of preparation achieved exactly what he'd planned. Bishop's men hadn't just failed to destroy the Double Cross Ranch, they'd sealed their own destruction, proving beyond doubt that their attacks were part of a larger conspiracy reaching to the highest levels of territorial government. And somewhere in Helena, Judge Harrison was receiving the first pieces of evidence that would bring it all crashing down. The storm's intensity seemed to match the growing realization among Cross's men that they'd walked into something far more sophisticated than a simple ranch defense. Reed, watching his carefully placed explosives become useless in the strategically flooded ground, turned to Cross with growing panic. "Those aren't regular irrigation channels," he shouted over the storm. "Look at the flow patterns. They're engineered to create specific flooding zones. I've seen military fortifications that weren't this well designed." Wilson, still studying the unfolding trap with professional appreciation, noted another detail. The cattle movements, the bell patterns, the light signals, it's all synchronized. Hayes didn't just build defenses. He created an entire language of signals that looks completely natural to outsiders. Through the rain-swept darkness, more evidence of Daniel's preparations became visible. What had appeared to be random rock formations along the valley walls now revealed themselves as carefully positioned observation posts. Common farmland features, fences, watering troughs, hay storage, transformed into interlocking defensive positions. "Sir," Tommy Parker's voice came urgently through their hidden communication network. "Martha reports Bishop's getting desperate. He's trying to send riders to every telegraph office in 3 counties, realizing too late that he can't trust any of his usual communication channels." Daniel allowed himself a grim smile. Bishop's strength, his network of corrupt officials and bought informants, was becoming his greatest weakness. The man had spent years building a system based on fear and bribery, never understanding that true loyalty couldn't be purchased. "Wheeler," he called softly, "time for the next phase. Show them why we spent so much time practicing night shooting with those special rounds." The valley suddenly erupted with precise, coordinated rifle fire. The specialized ammunition created patterns of colored flame visible through the storm, each sequence carrying specific meaning to the defenders while completely confusing the attackers. To Cross's men, it appeared as if they were surrounded by an army of expert marksmen. "It's not just the ranch," Wilson realized, watching the display with growing comprehension. Every homestead, every barn, every supposedly innocent farming feature in this valley, they're all part of it. Hayes spent 8 years turning the entire region into one giant tactical position. Sarah, observing from their concealed position, noted how the former Pinkerton's professional appreciation was tinged with bitterness. He's finally understanding why Bishop's usual tactics never worked here. You can't intimidate a community that's spent years preparing to stand together. The gang's frustration reached a breaking point as another of Reed's explosives detonated prematurely, triggered by the strategically directed water flow. The blast revealed not just the uselessness of their prepared demolitions, but something far more damaging, a cache of hidden documents Bishop had ordered them to destroy, railroad surveys. Cross spat, recognizing the waterproof containers now exposed by the explosion. Construction plans, water rights transfers. Hayes wasn't just defending his ranch. He was collecting evidence, waiting for us to provide the final proof of Bishop's conspiracy. Daniel's voice carried clearly through the storm, though its source remained impossible to pinpoint. Bishop thought he could control these valleys by corrupting a few officials, intimidating a few ranchers. He never understood that real strength doesn't come from fear or money. It comes from people choosing to stand together. As if to emphasize his words, new signals appeared through the darkness. Lanterns lit in farmhouse windows, seemingly random, but carrying precise meaning to those who knew the code. Cattle movements that seemed like storm-driven panic, but actually coordinated the defenders' positions. Even the way the rain-swollen streams flowed through the valley now served the community's defense. "You've lost, Cross," Daniel continued. "But more importantly, Bishop's lost. Every action you take here tonight, every attempt to burn us out or force us off our land, just adds to the evidence Judge Harrison is receiving. Evidence that proves this isn't just random ranch violence. It's a coordinated campaign of corruption reaching all the way to Chicago." Wilson, his Pinkerton training allowing him to see the full implications, laughed with grudging respect. The perfect trap. Bishop's own arrogance, his need to make an example of the double-cross ranch, gives Harrison exactly what he needs. Proof that the ranch burnings are connected to the railroad's land grabs. The storm's fury continued to build, but now it served the defenders' purposes. Years of preparation had taught them how to use the weather, the terrain, even the natural movements of valley life as weapons. Cross's men found themselves not just outmaneuvered, but completely incorporated into Daniel's larger plan. Thunder rolled across Crystal Creek Valley as Bishop's carefully constructed scheme began to unravel. The very violence he'd ordered against the Double Cross Ranch was becoming the evidence that would destroy his empire of corruption. And somewhere, in the storm-swept darkness, Daniel Hayes allowed himself to appreciate the justice of it. The man who thought he could rule through fear was about to be undone by the strength of united communities. Through the storm-swept darkness of Crystal Creek Valley, a new sound cut across the chaos of the failed assault, the rapid hoofbeats of a horse being ridden hard. Sarah Mitchell's trained ear caught it first, recognizing the distinctive rhythm of a messenger's urgent approach. "Eastern Trail," she reported quietly. "Single rider, moving fast but trying to stay quiet. Professional technique." Daniel Hayes studied the approaching figure through the rain. The rider's posture, the way they handled their mount. This wasn't one of Bishop's common thugs. This was someone with serious training. Catherine Reynolds, Wilson called out suddenly, his voice carrying recognition and surprise. Bishop sending in his specialist. The name triggered instant alertness among Daniel's companions. Catherine. Reynolds had a reputation throughout the territories. A former Army intelligence operative who'd gone private, specializing in handling complicated situations for wealthy clients. Her presence meant Bishop was raising the stakes significantly. Reynolds reined in beside Cross, her presence immediately changing the dynamic among the gang's leadership. Even through the storm, Daniel could read the shift in body language. These men feared her, and with good reason. "Bishop's received some disturbing telegrams," Reynolds announced, her cultured voice carrying clear authority. "Or rather, he's received no telegrams at all from certain key stations. Most interesting." She surveyed the scene with professional assessment, taking in the flooded grounds, the exposed survey markers, and the evidence of the gang's failed assault. Her expression showed neither surprise nor concern, only cold calculation. "You've bungled this badly," she informed Cross, "but more importantly, you've failed to understand what you're actually facing. This isn't just about one ranch." Wheeler shifted position slightly, adapting their defensive coverage. "She's dangerous," he whispered. "Worked with her during the Apache campaigns. She doesn't just solve problems, she rewrites the whole situation." "Bishop's plans have evolved," Reynolds continued, addressing the gang but pitching her voice to carry across the valley. "The Double Cross Ranch is no longer simply a target for acquisition. Mr. Bishop is now offering $100,000 for proof of criminal conspiracy against his legitimate business interests." Daniel felt his allies tense at this new development. Reynolds wasn't just announcing a bounty, she was changing the entire legal landscape of the conflict. "Clever," Sarah muttered. "She's trying to flip the narrative, make it look like we're the conspirators, targeting Bishop's legitimate operations." Through their concealed observation post, they watched Reynolds distribute documents to Cross's lieutenants. Even from a distance, Daniel recognized the official seals, territorial court orders, presumably obtained through Bishop's corrupt officials. "These warrants," Reynolds announced, "authorize the immediate investigation of suspected criminal conspiracy against licensed railroad development. Any resistance to lawful agents of the territory will be considered admission of guilt." Wilson's bitter laugh carried through the storm. "Brilliant play. She's not just trying to burn out a resistant rancher. She's creating a legal framework to justify everything Bishop's been doing." Daniel's mind raced, analyzing this new threat. Reynolds wasn't just Bishop's enforcer, she was his legal architect, building the foundation for what would appear to be legitimate prosecution of anyone who resisted his plans. "Tommy," he called, softly. "Get word to Martha. Judge Harrison needs to know about these warrants immediately, and tell Emma." But Emma Taylor had already anticipated this development. New signal patterns appeared across the valley. Not the defensive coordinates they'd been using, but a different code altogether, one that had been prepared specifically for legal complications. "Sir," Tommy reported moments later, "Martha says Harrison's already received similar warrants in Helena, but he's also gotten our documentation of Bishop's real activities. The judge is preparing counter-warrants based on evidence of corruption." Reynolds, however, wasn't finished. She produced another document, this one bearing federal seals. "The Department of the Interior has expressed concern about potential interference with authorized railroad expansion. They've appointed a special investigator with full authority to protect vital transportation infrastructure." "Let me guess," Wilson called out, his voice heavy with irony. "You're that investigator?" Reynolds' smile was cold. "As of this morning, which means everything that happens here tonight falls under federal jurisdiction. Mr. Hayes, you're no longer simply defending private property. You're now suspected of interfering with official government operations." Daniel had to admire the comprehensiveness of Bishop's strategy, By securing federal appointment for Reynolds, he'd elevated the entire conflict. Any resistance could now be painted as opposition to legitimate government interests. But Bishop and Reynolds had made one crucial miscalculation. Daniel Hayes hadn't spent 8 years simply preparing to defend his ranch. He'd been building a case that went far beyond local property disputes. "Sarah," he whispered, "signal Martha. Tell her it's time to implement Protocol 7. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. Protocol 7 was something they'd prepared but hoped never to need. The complete exposure of Bishop's entire operation, not just in Montana Territory, but across 5 states, sir. Tommy's urgent whisper carried new information. U.S. Marshal Sullivan just arrived at the church. He's got papers from Judge Harrison. Federal warrants issued in Washington, not just territorial court orders. Daniel allowed. Himself a grim smile. Bishop thought he'd crafted the perfect legal trap, using Reynolds' federal authority to legitimize his land grab. But he'd overlooked something crucial about Judge Harrison. The man had friends in Washington who'd been building their own case against railroad corruption. "Miss Reynolds," Daniel called out, letting his voice carry clearly through the storm. "Those are impressive credentials. But you might want to consider something before you proceed with this federal intervention." Reynolds' posture shifted slightly. The first indication that something in this situation wasn't following her careful script. "The Department of the Interior is very interested in railroad development," Daniel continued, "particularly in cases where railroad interests intersect with water rights. I imagine they'd be fascinated by certain documents we've been gathering. Documents that show exactly how Bishop's organization has been manipulating federal land grants. Through the rain, he could see Reynolds processing this new information, reassessing the situation with professional thoroughness. She'd come expecting to find a simple case of local resistance to railroad expansion. Instead, she was discovering that the Double Cross Ranch was at the center of something far more complex. "Mr. Hayes," she replied carefully, "are you suggesting that you have evidence of irregularities in official railroad development plans?" Evidence. Daniel smiled, though none of Bishop's people could see it through the storm. "We have 8 years of documented proof. Every fake land survey, every corrupted water rights transfer, every connection between Bishop's legitimate businesses and the gangs he uses to intimidate property owners. And now, thanks to your official intervention, we have proof that he's attempting to use federal authority to cover his criminal enterprise." Reynolds' silence spoke volumes. She was quickly realizing that Bishop had sent her into a situation far more complicated than she'd been led to believe. Her federal authority, intended to legitimize Bishop's land grab, could just as easily be used to expose his entire operation. "You see, Miss Reynolds," Daniel continued, "Bishop made a crucial mistake. He thought he was just facing stubborn ranchers trying to protect their land. He never understood that we were building something much larger, a case that would expose corruption from Crystal Creek Valley all the way to Washington." Thunder rolled across the valley as Reynolds considered her position. She built her reputation on handling complicated situations, but this was rapidly becoming something else entirely. Bishop hadn't just given her a problem to solve, he'd made her an unwitting part of evidence that could destroy his empire. "Sir," Tommy whispered urgently, "Martha reports new telegraph traffic. Bishop's trying to contact his allies in the territorial government, but they're already running scared," Daniel finished, "because Judge Harrison's warrants aren't just targeting Bishop, they're going after every corrupt official who's been helping him manipulate federal land grants." The storm's fury matched the tension now building in Crystal Creek Valley. Reynolds had arrived thinking she would simply legitimize Bishop's takeover through federal authority. Instead, she found herself at the center of what was rapidly becoming one of the largest exposures of railroad corruption in territorial history. "You know what's interesting about federal appointments, Miss Reynolds?" Daniel's voice carried through the rain. They come with very specific responsibilities, including the obligation to report evidence of criminal conspiracy, even if that evidence implicates the people who arranged your appointment. Reynolds's posture shifted subtly, the movement of someone reassessing their tactical position. You're suggesting I should ignore direct orders from the Department of the Interior based on unsubstantiated allegations? Not unsubstantiated, Sarah called out, recognizing the moment to reveal another layer of their preparation. The Pinkerton Agency has been building its own case against Bishop's organization. Why do you think Wilson here switched sides? He found evidence that even his corrupt superiors couldn't bury. Wilson's bitter laugh confirmed her words. 8 months investigating railroad land fraud. Every time I got close to proving Bishop's connection to the ranch burnings, evidence would disappear, witnesses would go silent. Then Hayes here reached out, showed me what he'd been building. A rather convenient story, Reynolds replied, but there was new uncertainty in her voice. Her reputation was built on handling complex situations, but she was beginning to realize just how complex this one truly was. Martha, Daniel whispered to Tommy, tell Judge Harrison it's time to release the Chicago documents. Let's show Miss Reynolds exactly what kind of operation she's been appointed to protect. Through the storm, new signals flashed across the valley, not the defensive. Patterns they'd been using, but a different code altogether. One that transmitted crucial information to their network of allies throughout the territory. Bishop's made another mistake, Wheeler observed quietly. By getting Reynolds appointed as a federal investigator, he's given her authority that works. Both ways. She can't simply ignore evidence of corruption now that it's been officially presented to a federal agent. Reynolds was clearly reaching the same conclusion. Her careful study of the valley took on new meaning. She wasn't just assessing tactical positions anymore, but looking for signs of the extensive documentation Daniel had mentioned. Those survey markers reads explosives exposed, she called out. Rather precisely placed, weren't they? Almost as if someone wanted them found in a way that could be officially documented by federal authorities. 8 years of preparation, Daniel confirmed. Every piece of evidence is carefully preserved, every connection documented. Bishop thought he was just facing stubborn ranchers. He never understood we were building a case that would expose his entire operation. A new rider emerged from the storm, U.S. Marshal Sullivan, carrying official papers that changed everything. Miss Reynolds, he announced formally, Judge Harrison presents his compliments and requests your immediate attention to these federal warrants. They authorized the investigation of suspected corruption in railroad land acquisitions across 5 territories. Reynolds's professional mask cracked slightly as she read the documents. These weren't just local warrants. They were part of a larger federal investigation that had been building for years. An investigation that now had her, in her official capacity, placed squarely in the middle of overwhelming evidence of criminal conspiracy. The Department of the Interior is very interested in railroad development, Daniel added, his voice carrying subtle emphasis, particularly in cases where private interests attempt to manipulate federal authority for criminal purposes. Through the rain-swept darkness, they could see Reynolds processing her options. She'd built her career on solving wealthy clients' problems. But this was different. Bishop hadn't just given her a complicated situation to handle. He'd made her an unwitting participant in crimes that were now officially under federal investigation. Sir, Tommy whispered urgently, Martha reports Bishop's telegrams are getting desperate. He's trying to reach his contacts in Washington, but those contacts are already running scared, Daniel finished, because Judge Harrison's investigation doesn't stop with Bishop. It reaches all the way to the railroad boardrooms in Chicago. Reynolds's voice cut through the storm, carrying new authority. Mr. Cross, I am temporarily suspending all operations under the previous warrants. As a federal investigator, I cannot proceed without properly examining these allegations of corruption. Cross started to protest, but Reynolds silenced him with a look that reminded everyone of her reputation. Unless you'd prefer I begin my investigation with your organization's recent activities? I'm sure Mr. Bishop would be fascinated to learn how quickly his subordinates cooperate with federal authorities. The balance of power in Crystal Creek Valley had shifted dramatically. Reynolds, brought in to legitimize Bishop's land grab, was now bound by her own federal authority to investigate the very operation she'd been appointed to protect. 8 years, Daniel said quietly to his companions. Bishop spent 8 years building an empire through corruption and violence, never realizing that every act of corruption, every burned ranch, every manipulated water right was being documented. And now it all comes crashing down, Sarah finished, professional satisfaction in her voice, not through gunfights or dramatic confrontations, but through careful preparation and the power of federal law. The storm continued to rage across Crystal Creek Valley, but its fury was nothing compared to the storm of justice about to break over Bishop's corrupt empire. And somewhere in Chicago, a wealthy man who thought he could control the territories, through fear and money, was about to learn a harsh lesson about the true power of united communities standing against corruption. Catherine. Reynolds' decision to suspend Bishop's warrants had transformed the standoff at Crystal Creek Valley, but Daniel Hayes knew the night's true challenges were just beginning. Through the storm's fury, he caught a subtle signal from the church tower. 3 quick flashes followed by a long pause. Martha Sullivan's urgent warning that something new was developing. Riders coming in from the north, Sarah reported moments later, her spyglass cutting through the rain. Not gang members. These are different. Professional equipment, military style. In formation, at least 12 men. Wheeler's experienced eye studied the approaching group. Private security, probably Bannerman men by their riding style. Bishop's not just sending thugs anymore. He's bringing in serious professionals. The arrival of Bannerman agents represented a significant escalation. Unlike the Raven Creek gang's brutal but predictable tactics, these men were trained in sophisticated operations. More importantly, they carried official licenses as railroad security, giving their actions a veneer of legitimacy. "Sir," Tommy's urgent whisper carried new information. Martha intercepted a partial telegram. "The bishop's not just trying to silence us anymore. He's implementing something called Protocol Omega across 3 territories." Reynolds' head snapped, up at the phrase genuine concern crossing her professional mask. "Protocol Omega? Are you certain? You know what it means?" Daniel asked, though her reaction had already confirmed its significance. "It's a contingency plan some railroad consortiums developed after the Great Strike," Reynolds explained. Her voice tight. When faced with organized resistance, they don't just attack their immediate opponents. They systematically destroy every alliance, every support network, every community connection their targets might have. The implications were chilling. Bishop wasn't just targeting the Double Cross Ranch anymore. He was preparing to tear apart the entire network of communities that had united against his corruption. Martha reports simultaneous telegraph traffic. "In 6 towns, Tommy added. "Bishop's men are moving against everyone who's ever helped us. The Thompson family we relocated. Their new place in Dakota Territory is about to have an accident. The judge's clerk, who verified our evidence, his brother's business is facing sudden regulatory issues." Daniel's mind raced. They'd prepared for Bishop to escalate. But this was different. The man wasn't just fighting to protect his operation. He was willing to destroy entire communities to maintain his power. "He's desperate," Wilson observed, his former Pinkerton training analyzing the pattern. "Protocol Omega is a scorched earth tactic. Bishop's willing to burn his own legitimate operations to destroy the evidence against him." Through the rain, They could see the Bannerman agents deploying with professional precision. Unlike the gang's crude intimidation tactics, these men moved with the coordinated efficiency of a military unit. "Miss Reynolds," the Bannerman commander called out, "Mr. Bishop sends his regards and requests that you secure any documentation relating to federal investigations. For safekeeping, of course." Reynolds's laugh was cold. "How convenient. Bishop wants to protect the very evidence that exposes his corruption. Tell me, does Protocol Omega usually include destroying federal records?" But Daniel's attention was already shifting to subtle movements throughout the valley. Bishop's escalation wasn't just about physical attack. It was a carefully coordinated effort to erase every trace of his criminal enterprise. "Sarah," he whispered, "signal Emma. Tell her to implement the sanctuary protocol. Bishop won't just target us. He'll go after every family that's helped build our case." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. The sanctuary protocol was something they'd prepared, but hoped never to need, an elaborate system for evacuating and protecting entire communities when legal defenses failed. "Wheeler, get word to Martha. Every telegraph office in our network needs to begin the documentation cascade. If the bishop wants to destroy evidence, let's make sure copies appear in every courthouse from here to Washington." The Valley's defensive network, built over 8 years of careful preparation, began to shift. What had been created to protect against physical threats now transformed to counter a different kind of assault. "Interesting approach, Mr. Hayes," Reynolds observed, watching the coordinated response. "You're not just defending against immediate attacks. You've built a system that actually grows stronger when threatened." Daniel allowed himself a grim smile. "Bishop thinks intimidation and violence are his strongest weapons. He never understood that attacking communities doesn't weaken them. It proves exactly why they need to stand together." Through their concealed observation post, they watched the Bannerman agents establish positions. These weren't crude strongpoints, like the gang had attempted. These were professionally designed formations meant to control key terrain and isolate targets. "They'll try to cut our communications first," Wilson predicted, drawing on his Pinkerton experience. "Standard Protocol Omega tactic: isolate each community before moving against it." But even as he spoke, new signals were appearing across the valley. Not the obvious telegraph lines Bishop's men would target, but subtler methods of communication that had been developed specifically for this situation. "Sir," Tommy reported, "Martha says Bishop's getting confused. Some telegraph offices show normal traffic, others complete silence. He can't tell which lines are compromised, because we're not just defending our normal communication routes," Sarah explained to Reynolds. "We've spent years building redundant networks, ways to coordinate, that look completely innocent to outsiders." The Bannerman commander was growing visibly frustrated as his men reported their inability to effectively isolate the valley. Every time they cut one line of communication, 2 more seemed to appear. "Those aren't just signal fires on the ridges," Wheeler pointed out. "Look at the patterns. The way they correspond with the church bells, the cattle movements. Every normal part of valley life is part of our communication network." Reynolds studied the complex system with professional appreciation. "You haven't just prepared defensive positions. You've turned the entire region into one interconnected network of communities. Bishop can't isolate you because he can't even identify all the ways you're connected." A new series of signals flashed across the valley, Emma's confirmation that the sanctuary protocol was active. Throughout 3 territories, families who had helped build the case against Bishop were quietly disappearing, moving through evacuation routes established years in advance. "Bishop thinks Protocol Omega will destroy our support network," Daniel said quietly. "Instead, he's about to learn what happens when communities are truly united. Every person he threatens, every family he targets, doesn't become a weak point. They become proof of exactly why we're fighting. The storm's intensity seemed to match the growing realization among Bishop's agents that they faced something unprecedented. Protocol Omega was designed to break organized resistance by attacking every possible alliance and connection. But Daniel Hayes hadn't just built alliances. He'd created a network of communities so deeply interconnected that attacking any part of it only strengthened the whole. Through the rain-swept darkness, new lights appeared across Crystal Creek Valley. Not defensive signals this time, but dozens of lanterns being lit in farmhouse windows. Each light represented a family choosing to stand openly against corruption, showing Bishop that his threats only proved the necessity of unity. The night's true battle was just beginning, but it wouldn't be won through gunfire or legal maneuvering alone. It would be won by communities standing together, proving that the strongest defense against corruption wasn't weapons or wealth. It was the unbreakable bonds between people who chose to protect each other. "Sir," Tommy's urgent whisper carried fresh intelligence. "Martha's intercepted another partial telegram. The bishop ordered something called financial containment across all territorial banks." Reynolds inhaled sharply. "He's calling in loans. Every bank he controls will suddenly demand immediate payment from anyone connected to this resistance. Families will lose their homes, their livelihoods." But Daniel's slight smile caught her attention. "Bishop still thinks like a corrupt businessman. He assumes everyone can be controlled through money or fear. Martha, show Miss Reynolds why that's a mistake." The telegraph operator produced a thick ledger, its pages filled with careful documentation. 8 years of financial preparation. Every threatened loan was transferred to independent banks. Every vulnerable mortgage is restructured through clean institutions. Bishop's banks will find their attempted foreclosures blocked by paperwork filed months or even years ago. Wilson studied the ledger with growing appreciation. "You haven't just been gathering evidence of Bishop's crimes. You've been systematically untangling his financial web, protecting every family that might be targeted." "Emma's social gatherings weren't just for organizing resistance," Sarah explained. "They were opportunities to help families protect themselves legally and financially. Every time Bishop's banks tried to establish control over a property, we found ways to secure it through legitimate channels." Through the storm, they could see the Bannerman agents growing increasingly frustrated. Their attempts to isolate and control the valley were being thwarted not by force, but by years of careful preparation. "Those supply wagons moving along the ridge," Wheeler pointed out. "Look at how they're positioned, not just bringing resources to threatened families, but establishing new communication lines to replace the ones Bishop's men cut." Reynolds's professional assessment took in the complexity of what she faced. "This goes beyond simple community defense. You've created an entire parallel system, financial, legal, logistical. Every time the bishop attacks one aspect, he reveals another layer of preparation. Protocol Omega assumes it's targeting isolated groups that can be broken through fear and pressure," Daniel explained. "Bishop never understood that real strength doesn't come from money or force. It comes from people choosing to protect each other, building connections that can't be threatened or bought." A new series of signals flashed across the valley. Martha's confirmation that Bishop's financial attacks were being turned against him. Every attempted foreclosure, every called loan became documented evidence of how his criminal organization used banking pressure to support land grabs. "The Bannerman commanders getting new orders," Sarah reported, studying the agents' movements. "They're shifting to aggressive containment, standard protocol Omega escalation. When pressure tactics fail, they move to direct action." But even as the professional agents began to move, the valley's defenses adapted. The carefully positioned cattle herds, the strategically placed supply wagons, even the pattern of lit farmhouse windows. Everything worked together to control movement through the region. The bishop made another miscalculation, Wilson observed. Protocol Omega is designed to isolate and destroy resistance, but you can't isolate people who've spent years building unbreakable connections. Through their concealed position, they watched as Bishop's sophisticated operation encountered something it wasn't designed to handle. Communities so deeply united that every attack only strengthened their bonds. "Sir," Tommy whispered. "Emma reports the first families are safely through the evacuation routes. Bishop's men are finding empty houses with no trace of where anyone went." Daniel nodded in satisfaction. The sanctuary protocol wasn't just about protecting people. It was about demonstrating to the bishop that his threats had no power over those who chose to stand together. "This is why Protocol Omega will fail," he said quietly. "Bishop thinks he's fighting scattered resistance that can be broken through intimidation. He doesn't understand that every threat, every attack, every attempt at control just proves to people exactly why they need to remain united." Reynolds studied the unfolding situation with new understanding. She'd been sent to legitimize Bishop's takeover, but instead found herself witnessing something unprecedented. Communities turning corrupt power's own tactics against it, using 8 years of preparation to transform threats into strength. The storm's fury continued to build over Crystal Creek Valley, but its power was nothing compared to the force of united communities choosing to stand against corruption. Bishop's Protocol Omega wasn't just failing, it was providing the final evidence needed to expose his entire operation. The storm over Crystal Creek Valley had intensified, but through the darkness, Daniel Hayes caught a subtle change in the Bannerman agents' movements. They weren't just establishing containment positions anymore, they were creating corridors, clearing routes for something approaching from the east. "Incoming," Sarah reported, her spyglass cutting through the rain. "3 carriages, heavy security escort. That's not Bishop's usual transport." Wheeler shifted position for a better view, then drew in a sharp breath. "Railroad police badges on those escorts. Those are corporate security chiefs from Chicago." The arrival of railroad executives transformed the situation dramatically. Bishop hadn't just escalated by implementing Protocol Omega, he'd called in his corporate masters to witness the destruction of resistance to their plans. 4 men in the lead carriage, Sarah continued, her trained eye catching crucial details. "Wait, Daniel, one of them is Richard Sterling." The name sent a ripple of tension through their concealed position. Richard Sterling was more than just another railroad executive. He was the architect of the entire land acquisition scheme that had devastated communities across 5 territories. "Sterling never leaves Chicago," Wilson muttered. "If he's here personally." "Then this isn't just about the double-cross ranch anymore," Daniel finished. "Sterling's presence means we've stumbled onto something bigger than Bishop's local operation." Through the storm, they watched Sterling's group deploy with practiced efficiency. Unlike Bishop's crude intimidation tactics, or even the Bannerman, agents' professional security measures, this was corporate power moving with calculated precision. "Sir," Tommy whispered urgently, "Martha's picked up new telegraph traffic. Sterling's arrival triggered some kind of emergency protocol in Bishop's organization. They're burning records across 3 territories." Reynolds studied the unfolding situation with growing concern. Sterling's not here to support the bishop. He's here to contain him. Corporate damage control. They're going to eliminate every trace of the railroad's connection to these land grabs. Daniel's mind raced, analyzing this new development. Sterling's arrival meant their evidence against Bishop had exposed vulnerabilities in the larger corporate structure. The railroad wasn't just trying to silence local resistance. They were trying to bury their own involvement in years of corruption. "Sarah," he called softly, "signal Emma. Tell her to implement the archive protocol immediately." The archive, protocol, was something they'd prepared but hoped never to need. A complex system for protecting and distributing evidence that could expose corruption at the highest levels of corporate power. Wheeler, get word to Martha. Every piece of documentation we've gathered needs to be moved according to the contingency plan. Sterling's people will be looking for central collections of evidence. They don't know we've spent years preparing for exactly this situation. Through their observation post, they watched Sterling's security forces begin systematic sweeps of the area. These weren't thugs looking to burn a ranch, or even professional agents containing resistance. These were corporate specialists trained to eliminate every trace of illegal railroad activities. "Look at their search pattern," Wilson observed, with professional appreciation in his voice. "They're not just looking for obvious evidence. They're checking all the places a former Pinkerton agent might hide documentation, which is exactly why we never use those obvious hiding spots," Sarah replied with grim satisfaction. 8 years of preparation meant learning to think beyond traditional methods. Reynolds studied corporate security deployment with growing understanding. Sterling's not just here to destroy evidence. He's here to eliminate Bishop's entire operation. The railroad can't risk their connection to these land grabs becoming public. "Bishop still doesn't understand what's really happening," Daniel said quietly. "He thinks Sterling's here to help him crush resistance. He hasn't realized he's become a liability his corporate masters need to eliminate." A series of precise signals flashed across the valley, Emma's confirmation that the archive protocol was in motion. Throughout 3 territories, carefully preserved evidence was being moved through channels Sterling's corporate specialists would never think to check. "Watch their formation," Wheeler pointed out. "The way Sterling's men are positioning themselves. They're not just containing us, they're containing Bishop's people too. Classic corporate double-cross." Through the storm, they could see Bishop's original forces becoming increasingly isolated. The Bannerman agents, recognizing the shift in power, were already adjusting their allegiance to Sterling's authority. "Sir," Tommy reported, "Martha says Judge Harrison's office just received an interesting telegram. Sterling's Railroad Consortium is officially disavowing all knowledge of Bishop's activities. They're claiming he acted without corporate authorization." Daniel allowed himself a grim smile. "Sterling thinks he's implementing a standard corporate containment strategy. Eliminate the evidence, disavow the local operator, protect the larger organization. But he doesn't understand what he's really walked into. The archive protocol," Sarah explained to Reynolds. "It's not just about protecting evidence. It's about using corporate tactics against them. Every attempt to destroy documentation creates new proof of conspiracy. Every disavowal becomes evidence of larger corporate involvement." Reynolds studied the unfolding corporate maneuver with professional appreciation. "You haven't just been fighting Bishop's local corruption. You've been building a case that could expose the entire system of railroad land fraud across multiple territories." Through their concealed position, they watched Sterling's forces begin their systematic attempt to erase all evidence of corporate wrongdoing. But what they couldn't see was how every move they made was being documented, every attempt at concealment becoming proof of a larger conspiracy. "Bishop's realizing something's wrong," Wilson reported, noting the growing tension among the original conspirators. "Look at how his men are responding to Sterling's deployment. They're starting to understand they've become expendable." Daniel Hayes felt the familiar calm of crucial moments settling over him. Sterling's arrival had changed the entire dynamic of their confrontation, but not in the way the corporate powers intended. Instead of simply crushing local resistance, they had walked into a carefully prepared trap that could expose decades of corporate corruption. 8 years, he said quietly to his companions. 8 years of not just gathering evidence, but building ways to protect it. Sterling thinks corporate power can simply erase any trace of their crimes. He's about to learn that some things can't be buried by money or force. The storm's fury matched the growing tension in Crystal Creek Valley as two forms of power collided. Corporate might trying to eliminate all evidence of its crimes, and united communities determined to expose corruption at every level. And somewhere in Chicago, railroad boardrooms were about to learn that their attempt to contain local resistance had instead triggered the exposure of their entire corrupt empire. "Movement at Sterling's carriage," Sarah reported suddenly. "He's meeting with someone. Daniel, it's Judge Morris from the Territorial Court." This new development drew everyone's attention. Judge Morris was supposedly one of the few territorial officials who hadn't been corrupted by Bishop's operation. "No," Wilson corrected grimly. "Morris isn't meeting with Sterling. He's reporting to him. Look at his body language. That's not a judge confronting corporate corruption. That's an employee receiving instructions." Daniel's mind raced, analyzing this revelation. Morris was never clean. He was Sterling's plant in the territorial court system, positioned to protect railroad interests at the highest legal level. "Which means every case he's handled involves land disputes," Reynolds began. "Becomes evidence of corporate manipulation of the legal system," Daniel finished. "Morris wasn't just protecting Bishop's local operation. He was ensuring Sterling's railroad consortium had control over every major legal decision affecting their land acquisitions." Through the storm, they watched the corrupt judge receive what appeared to be new instructions from Sterling. The corporate executive's manner was coldly efficient, showing none of Bishop's theatrical intimidation tactics. "Sir," Tommy whispered. "Urgently, Martha reports something strange in the telegraph traffic. Morris has been sending coded messages to every bank in the territory, some kind of financial directive." "Asset seizure orders," Reynolds realized aloud. "They're not just going to destroy evidence. They're going to legally confiscate every piece of property that might contain documentation of their crimes." But Daniel's slight smile caught her attention. "Check the dates on our property transfers, Miss Reynolds. Every piece of land that holds crucial evidence was legally moved out of Morris's jurisdiction months ago." Sarah produced a carefully maintained ledger. "We've known about Morris for years. Every time he handled a land dispute case, we tracked how his decisions benefited Sterling's operations, built a complete record of judicial corruption disguised as normal court proceedings." "And now Sterling's giving him new orders," Wilson observed, not realizing that Morris's every action is being documented. The judge thinks he's helping contain evidence, but he's actually creating proof of corporate control over territorial courts. Through their concealed observation post, they watched Sterling's operation continue to unfold. The corporate security teams were conducting their sweeps with professional thoroughness, but they were looking in all the wrong places. They're searching building records, land office files, bank vaults, Wheeler pointed out. All the places. Corrupt corporations usually hide their paper trails. They haven't realized we never used their normal channels. "Because you hid the evidence in plain sight," Reynolds understood suddenly. "All those community gatherings, social events, church meetings, they weren't just for coordination. They were legitimate activities that created their own documentation, their own records. Records that prove exactly how Sterling's operation worked," Daniel confirmed. "Every time Morris made a corrupt ruling, every time Bishop's men intimidated a rancher, every time the railroad manipulated land prices, it's all documented in normal community activities that corporate investigators would never think to check." A new series of signals flashed across the valley, Emma's network confirming that Sterling's attempt at containment was actually exposing more of his operation. The corporate giant had brought his full power to bear, never realizing he was walking into a trap 8 years in the making. "Sir," Tommy reported with barely contained excitement, "Martha says Judge Harrison just received the complete record of Morris's corrupt rulings. Not just his decisions, but documented proof of how they coordinated with Sterling's land acquisitions. And Sterling himself just hand-delivered the final piece of evidence." Wilson added with professional appreciation. By showing up in person to direct Morris's actions, he's provided direct proof of corporate control over territorial courts. Through the storm, they could see Bishop finally beginning to understand his situation. The local crime boss had thought Sterling's arrival meant corporate support for his operation. Instead, he was watching his corporate masters systematically prepare to eliminate him, along with all evidence of their connection. 8 years, Daniel said quietly to his companions. For 8 years, Sterling's railroad consortium thought they were buying control over these territories. They never understood that every corrupt judge, every manipulated land deal, every act of corporate intimidation was being documented by the very communities they thought they could control. Reynolds studied the unfolding corporate operation with new understanding. She'd been sent to legitimize Bishop's takeover, but had instead become witness to something unprecedented. Communities using corporate power's own tactics to expose corruption at its highest levels. Your archive protocol, she said thoughtfully. It's not just about protecting evidence. It's about using Sterling's containment attempt to expose the entire system of corporate corruption. Daniel nodded as new. Signals confirmed their counter-operation was working perfectly. Sterling had brought the full force of corporate power to Crystal Creek Valley, intent on burying all evidence of railroad corruption. Instead, his very presence was becoming the proof that would expose decades of corporate crime. The storm's intensity seemed to match the growing realization among Sterling's forces that they faced something unprecedented. They had come to implement a standard corporate containment strategy, but found themselves instead providing the final evidence needed to expose their entire corrupt empire. And somewhere in Chicago, railroad boardrooms were about to learn a harsh lesson about underestimating the power of united communities standing against corporate corruption. The storm that raged over Crystal Creek Valley wasn't the only force gathering strength that night. As Sterling's corporate forces attempted to contain what they thought was a simple local resistance, something unprecedented was taking shape across 3 territories. Through carefully maintained networks built over 8 years, communities were mobilizing in ways corporate power had never anticipated. Signal from the North Ridge, Sarah reported, her trained eye catching subtle movements through the rain. The Anderson family just lit their barn lanterns. That's the 4th homestead in the pattern. Daniel studied the growing chain of lights appearing across the valley. To Sterling's security forces, they would look like simple storm preparations. Farmers checking their properties, ranchers securing livestock. But each light carried specific meaning, coordinating a response that stretched far beyond Crystal Creek. "Sir," Tommy whispered urgently, "Martha reports the Merchants' Council in Helena just called an emergency meeting. Every store that Bishop's operation pressured, every business they threatened, they're all coming forward with documentation." This was exactly what their years of preparation had built toward. While Sterling focused on containing obvious evidence, the real proof of corporate corruption was emerging through channels he'd never think to check. "Look at Morris," Wilson observed, noting the corrupt judge's growing agitation. "He's realizing those weren't just routine business records he helped Bishop suppress. Every case he ruled on created a paper trail connecting Sterling's railroad directly to local intimidation." Through their concealed position, they watched Sterling's corporate security teams continue their systematic sweep of the valley. Their professional training told them to search official records, bank vaults, legal offices, all the places corrupt corporations typically hide their paper trails. "They still don't understand," Reynolds said quietly with professional appreciation. In her voice, every place they're searching has been prepared specifically for them to find it, while the real evidence is being protected by the very communities they thought they could control, Daniel finished. Sterling's containment operation isn't just failing, It's actually helping distribute our documentation more widely. A new series of signals caught their attention, not the obvious lantern patterns Sterling's men were tracking, but subtler signs woven into normal valley life, cattle movements that seemed random but carried precise meaning, church bells ringing what appeared to be standard evening patterns but actually coordinated community responses. "Wheeler," Daniel called softly, "show Miss Reynolds the merchant's ledgers. Let her see exactly what 8 years of preparation looks like." The former cavalry scout produced a series of ordinary-looking business records, but as Reynolds studied them, her professional expertise revealed their true significance. These aren't just sales records, she realized. Every transaction, every business dealing, they're all documented in ways that prove corporate manipulation of local economies, the pressure on merchants, the forced partnerships. 8 years of normal business activity, Sarah confirmed, all carefully recorded to show exactly how Sterling's Railroad Consortium used Bishop's operation to control territorial commerce. Through the storm, they could see Sterling's frustration growing as his containment operation failed to find the evidence he sought. The corporate executive had brought overwhelming force to crush local resistance, never understanding that the very communities he thought he could intimidate had spent years preparing for this moment. "Sir," Tommy reported with barely contained excitement, "Martha says it's spreading beyond the territories. Newspapers in Chicago just received anonymous documentation of railroad land fraud. Similar packets are appearing in press offices across 5 states. Daniel allowed himself a grim smile. The archive protocol wasn't just about protecting evidence. It was designed to ensure that corporate attempts at containment would actually trigger wider exposure of corruption. "Sterling's made another mistake," Wilson observed, his Pinkerton training analyzing the pattern. "By bringing his corporate security force here personally, he's created direct links between railroad leadership and Bishop's criminal operation. The very men he sent to contain evidence are becoming proof of corporate involvement." Reynolds studied the unfolding situation with growing understanding. "This goes beyond standard corporate corruption. You haven't just documented illegal activities. You've exposed an entire system of corporate control over territorial development." New signals flashed across the valley as Emma's network confirmed more communities joining the coordinated response. What Sterling saw as scattered local resistance was actually an intricately connected system of mutual support and protection. "Watch the supply wagons," Wheeler pointed out. "The way they're moving through the valley. Sterling's men think they're just normal storm preparations, but each wagon carries specific documentation to specific destinations. And the more his forces try to contain the situation," Sarah added, "the more evidence reaches Judge Harrison's office. Every corporate security team that searches a homestead creates new proof of railroad involvement in local intimidation." Through their observation post, they could see Bishop finally grasping the full implications of his situation. The local crime boss had thought Sterling's arrival meant corporate support. Instead, he was watching his operation become the key evidence that would expose decades of railroad corruption. "Sir," Tommy whispered, "Martha reports something strange in the telegraph traffic. Sterling's getting messages from Chicago, but they're not from his railroad consortium. They're from bank executives," Daniel finished, recognizing the pattern, "the financial institutions that helped fund his land acquisition scheme. They're realizing that exposure of railroad corruption could reveal their own involvement." Reynolds's professional mask cracked slightly as she understood the implications. Sterling's not just trying to protect railroad interests anymore. He's trying to prevent the collapse of an entire network of corporate corruption. But even as Sterling's operation grew more desperate, the communities they sought to control were demonstrating true power. Every attempt at corporate containment was met with carefully prepared responses, turning their own tactics against them. 8 years, Daniel said quietly to his companions. For 8 years, Sterling thought he was buying control over these territories. He never understood that every corrupt judge, every manipulated land deal, every corporate intimidation tactic was being documented by the very people he thought he could silence. The storm's fury seemed to match the growing realization among Sterling's forces that they faced something unprecedented. They had come to implement a standard corporate containment strategy, but found themselves instead providing the final evidence needed to expose their entire corrupt empire. And across 3 territories, communities that corporate power thought they could control through money and fear were demonstrating a different kind of strength, the power of people united against corruption, turning corporate tactics into proof of their own crimes. New signal from the church tower, Sarah reported. Suddenly, the Morrison family's store in Helena just had an interesting visitor, a banking examiner from Washington, arriving weeks ahead of schedule. Daniel's eyes narrowed at this development. Not a coincidence. Judge Harrison must have contacted his federal connections. The banking investigation we've been building evidence for is starting early, Reynolds finished, understanding dawning. While Sterling's focused on containing local evidence, federal investigators are already examining his financial network. Through the storm, they watched Sterling receive this news from one of his corporate messengers. The executive's composed facade cracked slightly, showing the first real concern they'd seen. "Sir," Tommy whispered urgently, "Martha reports unusual activity at territorial banks. Emergency withdrawals, account transfers. Sterling's financial allies are trying to distance themselves from his operation." Wilson studied these developments with professional appreciation. "The banking records we've been gathering, they don't just prove railroad corruption. They expose how legitimate financial institutions helped facilitate corporate land grabs." 8 years of transaction histories, Sarah confirmed. Every forced loan, every manipulated foreclosure, every case where banks cooperated with bishops, intimidation tactics, all documented through normal business records that corporate investigators would never think to question. A new series of signals flashed across the valley, Emma's network reporting similar banking activity throughout the territory. Sterling's attempt to contain evidence of corruption was actually triggering the very financial investigation they'd spent years preparing for. "Look at Morris," Wheeler pointed out, noting the corrupt judge's increasing panic. "He's realizing those banking records don't just implicate Sterling. They prove how territorial courts helped banks pressure landowners into selling to the railroad. Through their concealed position, they watched Sterling's corporate security teams continue their futile search for evidence, not realizing that every property they investigated created new proof of organized corruption." "The supply wagons are changing pattern," Sarah observed. "They're not just moving documentation anymore. They're positioning themselves to block specific routes, the ones Sterling's men would need to reach certain banks and businesses." Daniel nodded in satisfaction. The community network isn't just protecting evidence. It's systematically cutting off Sterling's access to his own financial resources. By morning, every bank that helped fund his operation will be under federal scrutiny. "Sir," Tommy reported with growing excitement, "Martha says Judge Harrison just received confirmation. The banking examiner brought sealed warrants from Washington. They're not just investigating Sterling's railroad. They're looking into every financial institution that participated in territorial land fraud." Reynolds studied these developments with professional understanding. "This goes beyond corporate containment. You haven't just exposed Sterling's local operation. You've triggered a federal investigation into the entire system of railroad financing." Through the storm, they could see Sterling's carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. The corporate titan had thought his power absolute, never realizing that the very communities he sought to control had spent years documenting how his empire really worked. Those aren't just business records, Wilson realized, finally understanding the full scope of their preparation. Every normal transaction, every routine bank dealing, they all show exactly how corporate money was used to support Bishop's criminal activities. And now, Daniel said quietly, Sterling's own containment operation is helping prove it. Every move his corporate security makes, every attempt to suppress evidence, just confirms the connection between railroad power and local corruption. New signals appeared through the rain. Confirmation that the banking examiner's arrival had triggered protocols in multiple federal agencies. Sterling hadn't just failed to contain evidence of corruption. He'd inadvertently helped launch a comprehensive investigation into corporate manipulation of territorial development. The storm's fury matched the growing realization among Sterling's forces that they faced something unprecedented. They had come to protect corporate interests through intimidation and force, only to find themselves helping expose the very system they sought to defend. And somewhere in Washington, federal investigators were receiving exactly what they needed: documented proof of how corporate power had corrupted territorial banking, courts, and commerce, all meticulously recorded by the communities that power had tried to control. Richard Sterling had built his corporate empire through careful control of every situation. But as he stood in the storm-swept darkness of Crystal Creek Valley, that control was slipping away. Through the rain, he watched his carefully constructed world begin to unravel, not through force or dramatic confrontation, but through the methodical exposure of years of corruption. "Sir," his chief of security reported urgently, "we've got a problem. The banking examiner in Helena, he's not alone. Federal marshals just arrived with additional warrants, and they're carrying documentation we've never seen before." Sterling's composed facade cracked slightly as he received this news. The corporate titan had faced challenges before, but this was different. This wasn't just local resistance to his plans. This was coordinated exposure of his entire operation. More signals from the north, Sarah reported from their concealed position, watching Sterling's growing realization. The Peterson family's mill just activated their warning system. Every business that Sterling's operation pressured is following the protocol we established. Daniel studied the unfolding situation with grim satisfaction. Sterling had brought overwhelming corporate force to crush what he thought was simple local resistance. Instead, he found himself facing something unprecedented, communities turning his own power against him. "Sir," Tommy whispered urgently, "Martha reports new telegraph traffic from Chicago. Sterling's board of directors is calling an emergency session. The banking investigation has spooked his investors." Through the storm, they watched Sterling receive this news from his corporate messengers. The executive's careful control was visibly shaking as he realized the true scope of what he faced. "Look at his security teams," Wilson observed professionally. "They're shifting from evidence suppression to protection detail. They know something's coming, something bigger than local law enforcement." Reynolds studied these movements with growing understanding. Sterling's not just trying to contain evidence anymore. He's trying to protect himself from his own organization. Corporate powers like this, when things go wrong, they sacrifice their own to survive. A new series of signals flashed across the valley, Emma's network confirming that Sterling's corporate allies were already beginning to turn against him. Banks that had supported his operation were now rushing to provide evidence to federal investigators, each trying to save themselves. "Bishop still doesn't understand," Sarah noted, watching the local crime boss's growing confusion. "He thinks Sterling's here to help him maintain control. He hasn't realized that corporate power only protects its tools until they become liabilities." Through their concealed observation post, they watched Sterling's carefully constructed facade continue to crack. The corporate executive had spent years building a system of corruption that reached from Crystal Creek Valley to Chicago's financial district, never realizing that the very communities he sought to control had been documenting every move. "Sir," Tommy reported with barely contained excitement, "Martha says Judge Harrison just received something interesting. Internal memos from Sterling's own bank showing exactly how they coordinated with Bishop's operation to pressure landowners." Daniel nodded in satisfaction. "The banking records we've been gathering, they don't just prove local corruption. They show how corporate power used legitimate institutions to facilitate criminal activities. And now," Wheeler added, "those same institutions are rushing to protect themselves by exposing Sterling's operation. Corporate loyalty only runs as deep as profit margins." Reynolds studied these developments with professional appreciation. "This goes beyond standard corporate corruption. You haven't just exposed Sterling's illegal activities. You've revealed how the entire system of territorial development was built on organized crime." Through the storm, they could see Sterling's security forces beginning to realize their situation. These weren't just professional agents protecting corporate interests anymore. These were men watching their carefully constructed world collapse, understanding too late that they'd helped document their own crimes. "The supply wagons are moving again," Sarah reported, tracking multiple signal patterns. "But they're not just carrying evidence now. They're positioning themselves to block Sterling's escape routes. Every road his men might use to reach friendly territory is already covered by our network," Daniel finished. 8 years of preparation, building connections that corporate power never thought to look for." New signals appeared through the rain. Confirmation that federal investigators were now moving throughout the territory. Sterling hadn't just failed to contain evidence of corruption, he'd triggered a comprehensive investigation into how corporate, money-controlled territorial development. "Sir," Tommy whispered urgently, "Martha reports something strange in the Chicago telegrams. Sterling's board of directors. They're not just calling an emergency session. They're authorizing something called total divestment." Wilson's sharp intake of breath showed the significance of this development. "They're cutting him loose. The entire corporate structure is going to deny any knowledge of his activities, claiming he acted without authorization." "Which is exactly what we've been waiting for," Daniel said quietly. "Sterling's own organization is about to provide the final evidence we need, proof that corporate corruption reaches all the way to Chicago's boardrooms." Through their concealed position, they watched Sterling receive this news from his increasingly panicked messengers. The corporate titan who had thought himself untouchable was discovering that his real vulnerability came not from local resistance, but from the very power structure he'd helped build. "Those bank records," Reynolds realized, finally understanding the full scope of their preparation. "You weren't just documenting Sterling's local activities. You were building a case that would make his own organization turn against him." Daniel nodded grimly. "Corporate power thinks it can control everything through money and fear. They never understand that their greatest weakness is their own nature, the way they'll sacrifice anyone to protect themselves." The storm's fury seemed to match Sterling's growing realization that he faced something unprecedented. He had come to Crystal Creek Valley to protect corporate interests through force and intimidation, only to find himself becoming the evidence that would expose decades of corruption. And somewhere in Chicago's financial district, boardrooms that had thought themselves untouchable were learning a harsh lesson about underestimating the power of united communities standing against corruption. The storm raged on, a fitting backdrop to the unraveling of Sterling's empire. His once imposing corporate fortress, built on manipulation and deceit, now lay open to scrutiny, its very foundations shaking under the weight of years of carefully documented resistance. Sterling paced nervously, his mind racing through the possibilities, but all avenues now seemed to lead back to the same devastating truth. He was being exposed, not by his enemies, but by the very system he had manipulated for so long. Through the dark, wet veil of the storm, the messages continued to pour in from across the territory. Each one seemed to tighten the noose around Sterling's neck. The last lines of communication were being severed one by one. Banks, once loyal to him, were now crawling with federal agents. His own employees, once compliant, were now under suspicion, their every move under the microscope. "Sir," Tommy said again, breaking Sterling's reverie, his voice barely audible over the howling wind, "we've intercepted more messages from Washington. The federal marshals, they're getting ready to arrest Bishop." Sterling's face twisted in disbelief. "Bishop," he muttered. "He's a tool, not the mastermind." "Not anymore," Tommy replied, his tone somber. "The people you thought you controlled are starting to talk. They've realized the game is up." Sterling turned sharply, anger flaring in his eyes. "I built this empire. I can't be brought down by the likes of them." But his words felt hollow, even to himself. The confidence that had once been his greatest weapon now felt fragile, slipping like sand through his fingers. "More than that, sir," Tommy added hesitantly, "Martha's tracking their final move. The divestment from the board is official. They've written him off completely. Sterling Industries is about to collapse, and they'll distance themselves from everything." Sterling's hands clenched into fists. The walls were closing in. Daniel, still watching from their concealed vantage point, spoke with a quiet but unwavering tone, his eyes trained on the unfolding drama. "The federal investigation won't just bring down Bishop, it'll unearth the whole corrupt framework that Sterling's empire is built on. They won't be able to escape the truth. The system of exploitation is too big to hide anymore." Sarah nodded in agreement, her eyes scanning the reports. "You've seen it, Daniel. This isn't just about one railroad. It's about the entire structure of corporate control, from the judges to the bankers to the landowners, the communities they sought to crush. They've turned the tables. What Sterling thought was his power has become his undoing." The weight of their words hung heavily in the air as they all watched, the rain beating down harder, as if mirroring the growing chaos around Sterling. They knew the storm was not only battering the land, but also sweeping away the very foundations of corporate dominance. Sterling's empire, long built on deception, was now crumbling in real time, with every calculated effort to suppress the truth now working in reverse. At the heart of it all, Sterling could feel his grip slipping. The betrayal from within, the board's swift abandonment, the mobilization of federal forces. It was too much. His own empire, designed to control and silence, was turning against him, each piece moving closer to the final fall. "He's done," Wilson said quietly. "He won't be able to fight this. His empire is finished, not just from the outside, but from the inside. The board, the banks, everyone who was part of this dirty system is jumping ship." Reynolds, ever the strategist, added with cold precision, "This isn't just the end of one man. It's the end of the entire structure of corporate overreach. The communities, the resistance, the documents they've gathered, they're the ones who have dismantled Sterling's world." As Sterling's corporate world continued to collapse, the storm outside began to quiet, the wind no longer howling as fiercely as though the earth itself had exhaled a deep sigh of relief. The foundations of power had cracked, and the truth was now undeniable. Richard Sterling had underestimated the very forces he had sought to control, and in doing so had sealed his own fate. For the first time, the people he had sought to silence, those he had ruthlessly pushed into submission, were now the ones who held the power. Through careful planning, persistence, and a deep understanding of how to manipulate the system back against him, they had achieved the impossible. The storm had passed. But Sterling's world would never be the same again. As the storm's fury finally began to wane, the silence that followed seemed almost unnatural, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Sterling stood motionless, staring out into the drenched landscape that had once symbolized the heart of his empire. The valley that he had so ruthlessly sought to dominate now seemed to mock him. In the distance, the faint outline of his security. Teams moving frantically was the last vestige of his once ironclad control. His mind raced with thoughts of escape, but deep down, he knew it was futile. The network was already too strong, the walls closing in on him too tightly. He could hear his own breath quickening, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him. His mind flicked from one failure to another. How had he underestimated these people, these communities? How had he allowed himself to believe that the power of money, of fear, would hold everything together? Tommy's voice pierced through the fog of his thoughts. "Sir, we've got confirmation. Bishop's people are scattering. They've cut ties with the operation. They're all turning on you." Sterling's chest tightened, but his words were steady, even if his mind was not. "They're all rats fleeing a sinking ship." Tommy hesitated before responding, sensing his superior's growing panic. "It's worse than that. They're all talking, sir. The local law enforcement, the judges, they're all cooperating with the investigation now. Everything they've ever done is on record." Sterling turned sharply, his eyes dark with a mix of anger and disbelief. "No, they can't do this." But his words were hollow. The truth was, he knew they already had. In the valley, hidden far from Sterling's sight, the resistance watched as their hard work reached its crescendo. Daniel, Sarah, and the others were not celebrating yet. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in years they allowed themselves a moment to exhale. They had exposed the links in the chain, and now Sterling was tangled in them, suffocating under his own corruption. "Look at him," Sarah said softly, her eyes fixed on the figure of Sterling in the distance, his silhouette barely visible through the mist of rain that was slowly lifting. "He doesn't even know how far gone he is." Wilson, ever the tactician, nodded. "He doesn't, and that's his biggest mistake. He still thinks this is something he can control. That's what makes him dangerous." Daniel turned to his team, his voice low but resolute. "The storm's over, but there's still work to be done. We need to make sure these records are locked down. The feds need to get all of them before Sterling tries to do anything desperate. If he's cornered, he'll make a play." Wheeler, ever vigilant, checked the signals once again. "We've already accounted for that. All of the sensitive information is in the hands of trusted sources now. No chance of him sweeping it under the rug. Then it's just a matter of time," Daniel said almost to himself, though there was no doubt in his mind now. Sterling's empire is finished. Meanwhile, in Washington, the ramifications of the storm's passing were already beginning to reverberate through the corridors of power. The federal marshals had arrived in full force, their presence a sign that the investigation had reached its climax. Sterling's empire, once seen as untouchable, was now a house of cards ready to collapse. The banks, the judges, the lawyers, the politicians, all of them were being swept into the investigation. One by one, the institutions that had aided Sterling's schemes were starting to buckle under the weight of the evidence. The banks, who had once stood as his greatest allies, were now scrambling to distance themselves from any criminal wrongdoing. They were offering up documents, testimonies, and evidence, each one eager to protect their own interests, hoping that by cooperating they might save themselves from the inevitable fallout. And then there was Bishop. The crime lord, who had once been a crucial piece of Sterling's operation, was now scrambling to save himself. His power base had fractured, his alliances crumbling, and now he was a fugitive, running from the very people he had once controlled. The message was clear. Sterling's operation had created too many enemies, both among the corrupt elite and the communities they had sought to oppress. The storm had shaken them all to their core, and now, as the rain slowed to a gentle drizzle, the pieces began to fall into place. Back in Crystal Creek Valley, the storm had passed, but the battle was far from over. The communities that had fought so long against corporate overreach now stood on the cusp of a victory they had not dared to dream of. But they knew this was just one step in a much larger fight. Exposing Sterling was a victory, yes, but the systems of power he represented were far from dismantled. His fall would be a beacon, but they would need to continue their vigilance. "We've won this round," Daniel said, his voice firm, "but we have to stay focused. This is just the beginning of the change we need." The team nodded, understanding the depth of his words. The fight was far from over. Sterling had been a symbol of corporate greed, but the true battle lay in dismantling the entire system that had allowed him, and men like him, to rise so high in the first place. And as Sterling stood there in the midst of his crumbling empire, with his hands tied and his future uncertain, the message from Crystal Creek Valley was clear. The people had taken back their power. Through the storm, through the years of struggle, they had not only survived, they had triumphed. And in the echo of that victory, Sterling realized too late that the empire he had fought to preserve would be his own undoing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.